Good evening and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library on AADL TV. Thanks for tuning in for tonight's presentation of Exploring the Mind with the University of Michigan Department of Psychology. In just a moment, Christopher Monk will introduce our guest, Dr. Abigail Stewart. To find past Exploring the Mind programs or view other virtual events, visit aadl.tv. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. I'm incredibly pleased to introduce Dr. Abigail Stewart. So Dr. Stewart is the Sandra Schwartz Tangri Distinguished University Professor of Psychology and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. Dr. Stewart completed her undergraduate degree at Wesleyan University and then went on to receive a master's degree in social psychology at the London School of Economics, and she received her Ph.D. in personality psychology from Harvard. She's received many impressive awards. I'm going to name just a few. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She was named the Henry Russell Lecturer. This is the U of M's highest honor for senior faculty. She received the Harold Johnson Diversity Service Award at the U of M. And finally, and believe me, there are many more, but I will stop here. She won the Eleanor Roosevelt Fund Award from the American Association of University Women. Dr. Stewart has also received funding for her work from the Ford Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Alfred Sloan Foundation, the Skillman Foundation, as well as the National Science Foundation. And then also, very importantly, Dr. Stewart has held many vital positions at the U of M, including serving as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Rackham Graduate School, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the College of Literature, Science, and Arts, the Director of Institute for Research on Women and Gender, and Director of the Women's Studies Program. Dr. Stewart's work combines qualitative and quantitative analyses of longitudinal studies of women's lives, studies of personality and political values, as well as attitudes about politics, immigration, as well as activism. Most relevant to today's talk, in 2018, she published a book with Virginia Valian that focused on why higher education has struggled to become truly inclusive and provide some guidance on how, as we design, implement initiatives aimed at realizing that goal of inclusiveness. Dr. Stewart's talk is entitled Creating Inclusive Environments, Universities as Case Studies. Here is Dr. Abby Stewart.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a very generous introduction. I really appreciate it. It's my pleasure to participate in this program, both because I'm delighted to do something for the psychology department, which has provided me with a wonderful and stimulating home for many years now, but also because I love the Ann Arbor District Library. So I'm pleased to participate in this series. I'm going to talk today about creating inclusive environments and specifically about universities as case studies. I appreciate Chris already mentioned that what I'm talking about is covered in the book that I worked on with Virginia Valian, my wonderful colleague, also a psychologist and linguist at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Everything that I'm going to talk about reflects this collaborative project. What we did in this book was to review the social science evidence that was relevant to the why inclusiveness is complicated and difficult, but also we reviewed practices and policies nationally that have been associated with greater inclusion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both the obstacles and the ways to overcome them. So the first logical question might be, why use universities as case studies? And of course, the simplest and a perfectly fair response would be, that's what Virginia and I know best. We both directed advanced programs at our institutions that were aimed at increasing institutional change toward greater diversity and inclusiveness. So have many institutions nationally. So that's the second point. quite a few universities have been engaged in a self-conscious effort to become more inclusive, and their efforts were supported by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, as was U of M's. So we were able to learn a lot from our colleagues around the country. And universities, therefore, have become a kind of laboratory for experimentation with new practices. The third reason is that universities are organizations. They have many of the same features other organizations have, and they generalize to lots of kinds of organizations. So no matter what kind of organization you are interested in thinking about, there's a lot here that I hope will be relevant. Of course, there are some unique things about universities, and I will try to notice them as we go along. So we started, Virginia and I, by noticing that academic institutions claim to represent some core social values that they hold, academic institutions hold very dear. We boiled them down to these 6. They represent the search for truth or knowledge, freedom to pursue all ideas, a respect for knowledge and expertise, and a valuing of creativity and innovation. They also include a commitment to merit, that is a strong belief in meritocracy, as well as a belief in access or inclusiveness. And I want to stop to say for a moment that academic institutions have not always aimed to be inclusive, but in the 20th century, they increasingly have aimed to be more inclusive. And of course, that is still a goal for academic institutions, as for many others. A lot of these qualities are things other organizations share with us, with academic institutions. And the last 2, the commitment to merit and to open access, are 2 that are quite common in many kinds of institutions. But they are also difficult to accomplish. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the first problem. We have trouble being a meritocracy because, in fact, it turns out people have a hard time judging merit accurately and inclusively, even when we want to. We also have trouble accomplishing access and inclusiveness because we actually have a lot of practices that limit access, many of which are not intended or understood day to day as limiting access, but they do. So those are the 2 goals or values that we zeroed in on as problematic for accomplishing diversity and inclusion, and also as possible to accomplish diversity and inclusion. So let's focus first on commitment to merit. And I've already pointed out it depends on being able to accurately judge merit. And why is that a really important thing? Well, like many organizations, universities require the people in them, especially faculty, to make a lot of judgments of merit. Sometimes I feel like we make them all day, every day. So of course, there are informal judgments. Is this talk I've gone to a good talk? Is this student I'm meeting with accomplishing what I hoped they would? And then there are the formal consequential judgments. We write reviews of papers and books and grant proposals, which may have the result of seeing work judged to be worthy or not. We also evaluate students in every class we teach them. Also more summary ways when we write letters of recommendation to support their next stage. Finally, we also evaluate each other constantly. We do annual reviews of each other. We do tenure and promotion reviews. We are subject to evaluation a lot, and we engage in evaluation of other people. And most of the time, we think we do that fairly and well. So the question is, are we right? And I've already kind of hinted that we aren't. We're not so right. So first of all, most judgments that are consequential include an element of forecast. We're admitting a student to college or to a major or to graduate school and forecasting that they will be capable of the work. When we hire faculty, we're forecasting they will be a good colleague, a productive colleague, and produce excellent research and teaching. Similarly, when we tenure and promote faculty, we're making a bet, a forecast about their academic future. But we know from everyday life that forecasts include a lot of uncertainty. The weather is an obvious example. Earthquakes, maybe depending on the part of the country one is in, another. Elections are hard to forecast and people are often wrong. Athletic competitions, people bet on them for a reason, it's not obvious. And perhaps most surprisingly, we are also poor at forecasting our own feelings. So if I try to forecast how will I feel when I've finished this talk, I am quite likely to be wrong in my estimate of how I will feel. So that's what we're thinking about. We're not even good at forecasting our own feelings. There are other threats to the accuracy of our forecasts that psychologists have studied. Perhaps the one they've studied the most is what's called the fundamental attribution error, which certainly makes it sound very grand, but it is a core important reality about our judgments. Whenever we have incomplete information, which is usually, we have a tendency as human beings to attribute outcomes, for example, success and failure, to a person. So for example, if someone wins a swimming match, we tend to think, well, they're a really good swimmer and they did a great job. We don't think the temperature of the water was good, they didn't have much competition. This was in fact a situationally determined outcome. Similar, but it might have been. And similarly, when we look at a good student who has good grades and we try to predict, will they be a good student in the future? If they're an A student wherever they are now, we're likely to think, okay, they'll probably be a good student. But the fact is, maybe everybody in that school gets A's. Then that wouldn't tell us anything about how good a student this is likely to be. So we rely on these individual indicators, even when we know they might not be accurate. And this tendency to attribute successes and failures to individuals has been understood as representing a kind of underlying belief that outcomes in the world are just. If you're wealthy, it's because you earned it. If you're poor, you didn't earn it. And that has also been sometimes labeled blaming the victim. So even if really the cause of a person's problems is external, we tend not to say that or notice it. So that's one important reason we may be inaccurate in our forecasts. We may overvalue individual information and under pursue situational information that would change our estimate. The second big challenge to the accuracy of our forecasts is something we call schemas, or implicit biases. These are beliefs or ideas about group-based qualities that may or may not apply to any given individual. So we may believe that in general, women are generous and kind, but any given woman may or may not be. Similarly, we may believe that in general, men are assertive and decisive, but any given individual man may or may not be. If we rely on group-based schemas for judging individuals, we will inevitably sometimes be wrong, maybe even often. And there's a large quantity of research in psychology, economics, sociology that pits two identical resumes and asks people to judge only one of them, one of whom is named as Joanne, and the other is named Jack. They're absolutely identical. And the question is, do they get judged as equally attractive to hire, equally deserving of the same salary, equally likely to get promoted? And lots of research has shown that these group-based schemas, which are the only thing that could account for the differences because it's identical information, those schemas are controlling a real difference. So there are real differences by people's gender, by their race, by their perceived sexual orientation, and their parental status in terms of these questions about hiring, salary, and promotion. There's also research on similar issues with respect to fellowships and grant applications and leadership outcomes. So can we remove the influence of schemas? Can we stop being biased unintentionally? Well, maybe. There are some things that help. So there's a concept of blind review. What if you don't know whether an applicant is male or female, or you don't know what kind of school they went to? Might that help? Yes, it might. Research has shown that we actually, when certain information, particularly gender, is withheld, we do a lot of active searching for cues that might tell us whether it's a male or a female, like the pronouns that letters of recommendations use, or the associations or organizations somebody belongs to. So it's not altogether easy to do blind review, and this search for cues may actually make us hyper attentive to the very thing we're trying to get people to be less attentive to. Now, there are cases where blind review is possible. That one is music auditions. So orchestras introduced literal physical screens and muffling carpeting that would prevent a person from being identifiable in terms of the kind of shoes they're wearing, as a way to cut down on the identifiability of musicians' performance. And in fact, it made a big difference. When people performed behind a screen and judges were simply able to judge the sound of the music, in fact, women were more likely to move ahead in competitive audition processes. So when it's actually feasible, blind review can be helpful, but it's not plausible in every setting. Another approach is to provide more individuating information. So if you know a whole lot about an individual person who, for example, let's say it's a man who's not decisive and assertive, but you know that he's brilliant and produces marvelous research papers, that might make the importance of assertiveness diminish. So we can reduce how much we rely on a schema if there's a lot more information available about the person. Even when we do that, even when there's a lot more information, there is evidence that schemas have some effect, but we can lower it. Are there other things we can do? Another thing we're prone to is relying on what I call proxies for excellence, one of which is prestige. So if I know somebody went to a very fancy institution that's very selective, I'm inclined to then think, well, that person got in there because they were worthy. Now, the corollary is a person who went to a less prestigious institution perhaps is less worthy. Well, that's a problem because there's no information about the individual carried by what institution they went to. A person could be not that worthy who went to a fancy place, and a person could be very worthy who happened to go to a less fancy place. Nevertheless, even though we know that, even though we're rational, in a very disturbing study, papers were resubmitted to a journal changing the institutional prestige of the author's presumed location, and that changed the fate of the paper. So papers that had previously been accepted were rejected, and papers that had been previously rejected were accepted. So that tells us something about how much we rely on proxies for excellence, even when our only job is to evaluate a single piece of work. Another example of the proxy for excellence in the way in which it operates, faculty in the United States very, very rarely end up as professors at institutions that are more prestigious than where they got their Ph.D. So in this particular study that's described here in 3 fields, history, computer science, and business, 461 different departments were considered, and there were 19,000 faculty in those departments. Around 10% of the faculty at all those institutions were at an institution more prestigious than where their degree came from. So 85 to 90% were from an institution that was as or less prestigious as the one they got their degree from. So that tells you it's powerful. We also tend to rely on another proxy for excellence, which is people who I know and trust, my network. I'm inclined to pay a lot of attention to the opinion of somebody I know and trust, and maybe to pay less attention to the opinion of someone I don't happen to know. We know that networks play an important role in scholarly circles, and this is also true in non-scholarly circles. It's sometimes talked about in terms of homophily, or the notion that we tend to be connected to people who are like us in some way. And our networks reflect those connections. The research has shown that women have more women in their networks and men have more men. So if we have a male-dominated field or a female-dominated field, the individuals in that field are going to know more people like them with respect to gender. And that's going to mean that there's a higher probability that they're trusting the opinions of those people, and therefore perhaps unintentionally biased in who they value, what students or applicants they value. This has been looked at in twice in the evaluation of fellowship applications in terms of the impact of gender in Sweden, not a country known for its oppressive gender relations. In an early study, very disturbingly, the authors found that women applying for a postdoctoral fellowship had to be 2.5 times more productive than a man to apply to receive the same reviewer rating as the average man. That was very troubling, and many people hope to think, well, that just happened in that particular process, but similar findings have been found in the US. This is not an easy thing to study. Many selection processes are quite secret, but when it's been possible to study it, a very similar pattern has been found. What was much less noticed when this study came out, and it had a big impact, is that there was an equally large impact from what was called a friendship bonus. If applicants were affiliated with a committee member, they got rated higher to the same degree as the gender bias. So it had a very large impact on outcomes. So what does affiliated mean? It meant anything from they actually knew them to they went to the same institution as an undergrad, didn't know each other, but just went to that institution, shared a mentor, shared an institution of graduate education. So didn't require people to actually know each other, but required that they be some few degrees of separation apart in terms of their history. The study was repeated 10 years later after they had adopted new procedures to get rid of gender bias, which was their focus. And happily, I'm happy to report that the new procedures worked. Gender was no longer a significant factor. But they hadn't really worried about nepotism or homophily or whatever it is that this friendship bonus reflects. And the reviewer affiliation variable was equally significant 10 years later. So if we don't do something actively about it, it doesn't just go away by itself. Now, why is that? Another factor is what Daniel Kahneman calls belief in our own expertise. In this wonderful book, which I do recommend to you, Thinking Fast and Slow, he thinks through and describes lots of studies he and his collaborators have done of the process of decision-making, and documents the fact that experts tend to rely on their intuition, or what he calls fast thinking, more than they deliberate or have a slow process. And they have very high confidence. So they're very certain of their opinions and they rely on their intuition. I have to tell you that this is a real description of faculty. We do believe we're experts. We're asked for our opinion in fields where we feel expert. And the likelihood is that we are both very confident of our opinion and probably arrived at that opinion based on a fast judgment, not a slow, deliberate process. Now, what Kahneman shows us is that intuition is actually reliable some of the time. It's reliable, it's fine, if you're in an environment that is what he describes as regular and predictable, or a high validity environment, and you've had a chance to practice this kind of judgment a lot. And you might think, well, sure, that's probably faculty. They probably have exactly that going on. Well, yes and no. He specifically draws a comparison between two medical fields, anesthesiology and radiology. Anesthesiology fits that first description of an environment that's regular and predictable. That is, certain medications in a surgery, for example, will have a kind of effect unless they don't, based on what's going on with the patient. The patient body is monitored, and there's lots of feedback to the anesthesiologist about what's going on. How is this working? And the anesthesiologist has a chance to change what they do. So they have lots of practice, lots of experience, and they get lots of feedback. Kahneman compares that to the radiologist, who takes an image, makes a judgment of that image. There is or isn't something worrying going on in that image. And then the process is turned over to somebody else. And that somebody else is going to kind of go down a further diagnostic trail in which the feedback will be slow and may never get to the first person. So Kahneman's point is that when you lack that kind of feedback loop, there is a difficulty in ever challenging or questioning your own intuition or your own fast judgment. Which is not to say radiologists are wrong. It's just to say it's harder to be right. And many faculty decisions are like that. We admit a student into a program, some of them thrive, some of them don't. Do we stop and examine how accurate were we? Where did we go wrong? Under what circumstances? We don't. We move on to making more judgments. So we don't have that kind of environment that Kahneman says allows us to really trust as reliable our fast opinions. What's the implication? The implication is clear, and other cognitive psychologists have made this case. Slow down the thinking, be more deliberate, think through, and I'm going to talk more about this in a minute, think through how you're arriving at your opinion. One of the ways that things that is a problem about our confidence is a process that social psychologists call moral licensing. They find that believing you're objective actually makes you less objective. So the people who report that they are very objective and can make an absolutely objective judgment. For example, this is used all the time in jury selection. Do you think you can be an unbiased judge of this person's behavior? The people who say yes to that are more likely subject to moral licensing than the people who say no. If you think you will be objective, in fact, that kind of gives you license not to be. It takes that worry off the table. And in one study, 2 different groups of adult men were asked to answer questions about their objectivity. Most of them said they were above average in it. A separate group was a control group, and they were, again, given a resume, two resumes of a male and a woman. There was no difference in the recommendation in the control condition. So the men did fine. They were actually objective in the control condition, but the men were favored over women in the objectivity condition, the condition where the men had reported, yes, I'm objective. So that's a worry. If when we are most certain, because we've said it out loud, that we're objective, is when we're not. That's something to think about. There's some other things we can do that are internal to think about. We can explicitly recognize uncertainty. We can think about how sure is this evidence? How likely is this prediction I'm making? We can also commit ourselves to thinking actively about the role of the situation, that thing that we often forget about in producing outcomes. So we can think, well, what access to resources did this person have? How likely is it that they're accumulating advantages or disadvantages because of how much access to resources they had in the past. We can also look at our own process of developing opinions. We can notice that we have irrelevant reactions and interpretations of things, that something might put us off and that we should set that aside. We also can explicitly think about alternative interpretations, and indeed the process of learning to be a scientist should make us good at that. But unfortunately, if we judge things quickly, we aren't good at that. And we can search for relevant, good evidence that will help us decide. Most of all, we can lower our confidence in our judgments, and that will make us more deliberate. We can also impose some external constraints that help us make better judgments. So having a comparative pool that includes a lot of diverse applicants very much helps us make a judgment about people. If everybody in a pool is the same, we're much more likely to produce what's called a halo, a kind of sense that, well, they're good at this, they're probably good at the other things we care about. We can also make sure we have enough information, that we've searched properly through the evidence, and we've avoided evidence that's likely to include bias. What is evidence that's likely to include bias? Well, it's anybody else's judgment we're relying on. So that might include students' evaluations of teachers. There's definitely real information there, but there's also the possibility that those evaluations are affected by group-based schemas. The same thing is true of letters of recommendation. There's been lots of research showing that applicants who appear equally qualified in terms of their credentials are described differently in letters. Males tend to be described more often, very well qualified males tend to be described more often as brilliant, creative, original. Females who are equally well qualified are more often described as dedicated, hardworking, even passionate. But those brilliance words are usually missing. And finally, we can avoid proxies for excellence. Those are all things that we can self-consciously and structure into the judgment process by establishing some situational constraints. So what do I mean by situational constraints? We can establish detailed criteria that are actually observable, where there's real evidence in the record that we could look at. And we can ask our evaluators to specify what evidence they're using. How are they judging that criterion, high or low? We can try to avoid allowing people, by doing this, by specifying and relying on criteria, we can avoid halos or intuitions or global judgments. Those are frequently used in search and hiring processes where committees are asked to bring in your top 3 candidates. That's fast thinking. That's encouraging people not to rely on specific evidence. So we need to interfere or disrupt that tendency. And we have to be disciplined in our evaluation of criteria across people. So if I require a certain standard of teaching for this person, I have to make sure I'm requiring that same evidence for everybody else. So I have to be equal in my expectations across people. If the judgment process is a group process, there are other things to consider. Having diverse members of a group is associated with more diverse outcomes, and that is not a function of the people who have an identity in common with an underrepresented group making different judgments, causing the group to act differently. The majority group members, they're the ones who behave differently when there's diverse group membership. That's really important. It's also really helpful if judgment processes are given enough time. So asking a group to make a decision in 5 days, reviewing 100 folders, you're going to get fast thinking. There's no alternative. So having enough time available is important. And finally, having an explicit process for correcting inaccuracies is also important. What I mean by that is it has to be possible when someone asserts something to say, wait a minute, I didn't see that in the record. What are you talking about? So that has to not be rude. It has to be invited. Okay, I'm going to shift now to talking a little bit about access, because access is the critical precondition for inclusion. So access requires fair judgment, and it's a critical precondition for inclusion. So it's a very important aspect of what we're talking about. Now, structural issues, and I'm talking here about social structures and organizational structures, affect who applies and who has access. So we can understand this, for example, if we are a very expensive institution, then the people who apply to go to us are likely to be people with more financial resources, unless we offer lots of information about ways that it is affordable, so that people whose instinct would be, well, this is not an institution for me, will be to at least consider it. So having plenty of information about how the institution is open to access, it is critical. In addition, different individuals may have different levels of preparation or information about what the process is like. Sometimes people have access to mentors who can tell them, well, here's what it's going to be like where you're going to go have a job interview. Other times people have no one to ask and no background knowledge of how that institution might operate. So if the institution makes it our job to put out that information, here's what will happen when you come or when you apply. Please be sure you cover these issues. And there are these culturally shared schemas that we have about who's talented, who's less talented, and those schemas affect access. So if we think, for example, that women are better at something, some field, and men are better at another field, that's going to affect how likely it is that a female or a male applicant will be viewed favorably, at least at the outset. So the first thing we have to do to foster inclusion is create practices that enhance equal access. One of those is proactive recruitment, which I've already kind of indicated. That's where we reach out to people who may think they don't belong, wouldn't be appropriate, who we really want to consider. We also need to develop fuller information and distribute it really carefully and widely for both admissions and applications for positions. We need to educate our faculty and in other organizations, whoever the decision makers are, about the importance of adopting careful practices to enhance fair judgment. You need to look at the practices you've already got that might be introducing bias unintentionally and change your practices so that you rely more on good evidence. One of the practices, for example, in higher education institutions is this reliance on letters of recommendation. More institutions nowadays only look at the letters of recommendation after people have really looked at the candidates fully without them. And then they look to them more as verification that a candidate is as qualified as they appear. And finally, adopting some of the practices I've already mentioned that enhance fair judgment, and I'll talk about some more, is important. And it's important for a couple of reasons. One is it ensures you actually bring into the organization the people you want, the range of people you want. But in addition, you inspire confidence in those people that you as an institution are careful about judgment. And that confidence is an important building block of trust in the organization. It's important here that one of the practices, and I alluded to it already, is bystanders' behavior. It is important for those practices to get talked about so that people in a judging situation hear about them, even if they haven't already been educated in them. So feeling empowered to actually express, I know this is supposed to be a best practice, helps other people learn about why that's a best practice or that it is. Okay, more directly, how do we foster inclusion? Well, there's some very important other things. One of them is, once you're in an institution, you're still vulnerable to other people's expectations. they may expect the world of you. They may think you're brilliant and be very inclined to see you as successful even before you kind of are. If they don't think that, if they expect that your performance may not be so exceptional or stellar, you may notice that they aren't really responding to you accurately. So this happens when, for example, people report that, gee, I got a paper published in an important journal in my field and nobody did anything about it. This other person published in that journal, and there was a department-wide email pointing it out. So I'm positive people are not intentionally doing that, but some of the time implicit biases lead us to circulate knowledge and praise based on implicit biases rather than on actual earned excellence. And that's obviously a strong message of exclusion, not inclusion. A second piece of other people's expectations is the way they give feedback. If they have low expectations for you, they might well say, gee, great paper, glad you wrote it, and I learned a lot from it. There are some things you could improve, but really it's fine. That is what we call patronizing feedback, because it is not taking seriously that you and I have the same goal, which is to make this paper as good as possible. So the people who've worked in this area have suggested that wiser feedback is feedback that says, gee, I think you're capable of an even better paper. This is a really good paper, but I think you could do more. And here's how. That's feedback a person is more likely to trust and certainly more likely to benefit from. And it's not equal who gets that wiser feedback. And we need to make it equal. A second problem or area is interpersonal comfort. If our comfort level in interacting with someone different from us is low, if we are not comfortable, our interaction is going to be awkward. And there's a lot of research to show that. It's not smooth, it's awkward, it's visibly uncomfortable. And that conveys a message of, you don't belong here because I'm not comfortable with you. So what can we do about that? How do we understand that? Claude Steele, a social psychologist who spent some of his career here, has written a lot about stereotype threat and the fact that it affects both majority group members and minority group members. So underrepresented group members expect that they will be devalued, that their performance will be undervalued compared to how good it is. So for example, if I'm a woman, I may think, well, you're going to assume that I'm not as bright as I am. And I'm going to worry about that. How do I show you that I am brighter than you think? So that is a weight in our interactions. It's a process that I have to be conscious of all the time. Equally, if I'm a member of the dominant group, in this case, I'm white, and I'm interacting with a person of color, I might worry, oh, I don't want this person to think I'm racist. If I'm worrying about that, that's a weight in this conversation that will keep our interaction from being comfortable. So both sides of the interaction process are weighted down by stereotype threats. And what Steele argues, and the evidence is strong, is we need to remove those threats from the environment, or else we can't reach a point where those interactions can be smooth. This is very related to the idea of the sense of belonging. Whenever we're in an organization, we need to feel like we're part of it and we can influence it. People value us. We belong, whether it's the university as a whole, my department, my dorm. We want to belong. That's part of being a social animal. And that sense of belonging can be helped or hurt. And then, of course, I've talked a lot about the capacity for fair judgments. Thinking that I will be fairly judged is an important feature in my sense of belonging, right? So those fair judgments matter not just for access, but also for inclusion. Okay, so what can we do to enhance inclusion? We can learn how to do we can learn about implicit biases, first of all, and learn to try to inhibit them, try to overcome them. We can also educate faculty and graduate students on how to give wise feedback and on the danger of patronization. I think this is a very important piece of education that we don't currently pay enough attention to, so that faculty and graduate students are not always alert to the ways their feedback may be actually harmful when it's meant to be helpful. In terms of stereotype threat, one of the big events that has been shown to decrease performance anxiety under these conditions is to normalize anxiety about performance. So if we say, yeah, everybody's anxious about their first class, or everybody's anxious about giving a talk to the in this series, then it's not about me, it's not because I'm a woman, it's just the way this works. So normalizing anxiety helps people feel it's okay, and it's not necessarily because I'm a member of a particular group. How do we reduce stereotype threat about potential criticism of our racism or sexism or homophobia? We can offer more opportunities for performance. So this isn't so high stakes, whether it's performing in the case of somebody who's trying to prove their excellence, or it's performing in terms of proving they're okay in their attitudes. So having enough occasions is important. So to lower the stakes. The most important thing, though, on this latter point is to create an atmosphere of openness. Some people are calling this calling in rather than calling out. So if I notice that you've said something that feels sexist to me, then I could try to open up a conversation about it by calling you into a dialogue rather than criticizing you. And not only does this matter when I'm doing it with you, it matters when a third party is watching us interact. So noticing that it's not so scary to actually make a mistake and express unintentionally a racist or sexist or homophobic thought, because there's an opportunity to talk about what did you really mean? Why did you say that? Do you really believe that, or was it mindless? Making it possible for people to say or do mindless things and get over them is part of calling in and keeping a group able to interact smoothly. What about the sense of belonging? One of the most powerful things we can do is reduce what are called ambient cues in the environment that you don't belong. So what are those? That's when a woman or a person of color walks into a room in an institution and all the pictures on the wall are of men or white people. That's a cue. This might not be the place for me. So we can just take them down. That's one possibility. Another is to think of what pictures could we put up that would be more diverse. Very often in institutions like Michigan, University of Michigan, that means not having pictures on the wall of the deans in the chairs, department chairs, or the people who've won prizes for the last 100 years, but instead of our students. We have a much more diverse student body, and the pictures of our students will signal belonging to a much broader group of people. So that's increasing the ambient cues. There are lots of different kinds of people belong here, and they're associated with success, and they're valued. I mentioned the capacity for fair evaluations. Not only do we have to make good evaluations, we have to make them transparent. We have to make it clear that people have lots of chances to succeed. Those help people who feel excluded believe that there is a chance for them to be included. So there are things we can do, very straightforward things that the research evidence supports to make our institutions actually more inclusive. Okay, let's suppose we do that. Can we make these changes stick, or will they go away after the well-intentioned person who introduces them leaves? Well, I think we can make them stick. We make them stick when we focus on policies and practices rather than on individual generosity or niceness or good judgment. So appointing good leaders is important, but it's not enough. We need policies and practices that survive those leaders. We need to ground those policies and practices in social science evidence, which is what I've tried to talk about today, but we also need to attend to local culture. So if in my department, interrupting everybody is normal, then figuring out how to be respectful is going to be a project that requires taking on the question, do we really have to interrupt people in order to be smart? Is that essential? Or is there another way for us to have a very good discussion of something without interruption, without risking interrupting the women more than the men or the people of color more than the white people, both of which have been demonstrated to happen. So you have to figure out how much is this a deep part of the culture, or how much is it easy to fix? And then you need to design policies that address different constituencies' needs. You have to pay attention to how your mentoring programs are going to work based on different constituencies, but there has to be a program that encompasses everyone. And then once you have policies and practices you think will work, you have to provide lots of educational and informational support, lots of explanation of why things work, rather than just saying, do it my way, because I said so. And be content to change what you can, where you can. You don't have to change the entire organization. You can improve life in your unit by adopting some new policies, and it's worth it to do that. Very often, what you do in that one unit becomes a model for others, and it can generalize. So, and even if it doesn't, you've made life for the people in your unit better. That's important. So I want to close by saying it takes a village to create inclusive organizations. It can't be done by the top leadership. I haven't talked so much about why, but it's true. It takes everybody engaging. It just can't be top down. It's helpful if you notice in your everyday life the things that actually decrease meritocracy, that make you rely on the wrong indicators and decrease inclusion. And then you can identify processes that might help. Every organization doesn't have the same problems. So of course, one size never fits all anything. And therefore, there's no textbook that's going to tell you you need to do these 6 things. What you need to do will depend on what the problems are where you are. And then you need to encourage the adoption of inclusive practices more broadly, if you can. Again, change what you can, where you can. But it's important to consider, is there a way I can encourage adoption of inclusive practices more broadly? Because very often people are moving from one organization, part of the organization, to another. If we do these things, there's a high benefit. And the benefit is we increase our chance of living up to our ideals. And doing that gives us the organization we say we want. And that can only be a good thing for us and for everybody else in the organization. Thank you again for giving me the chance to talk about this with you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Abby. That was fantastic. That was great. I wish we had give you some virtual applause for you. That was lovely. I have a few questions for you. Sorry, I have a lot of background light coming from the window, so I look like just a shadow at the moment. The first question is about what are the best measures or variables that we could use for on search committees or for potential graduate students. Historically, maybe I'm wrong on this, but heuristically, I'll say people thought that recommendations could be very insightful, but I just know anecdotally that those vary tremendously from country to country. You could tell an English recommendation from an American recommendation. And it varies based on the individual. And I'm sure there are a lot of biases that you pointed out that also come up. So those may not be useful. And it was really helpful to hear that that we may want to set those aside for later in the process.
Right.
Are there measures for at any level of career that are not particularly biased?
Right. So yes, the best sort of summary statement I can give you is behavior. Behavior is your best measure rather than the behavior of the applicant. So in the case of students, it's not just how did they do in school. You are going to have to try to assess how have they done, because the best predictor of doing well in school is having done well in school, as you know.
Mm.
But it's not enough, especially not at the highest levels. So if you're talking, for example, about admission to graduate school, which you brought up, there's a concept that's out there called fire in the belly. Does a person seem to have a passion for understanding a phenomenon or for a domain of knowledge? That is a very important quality, because a career and so it's very important in academia. It's a good indicator for graduate students. I'm not suggesting it's the most important criterion in every organization. Depends on what you're hiring. But if you're trying to decide about a graduate student, this kind of passion is a much better predictor than, for example, an extremely well-written essay that speaks about lots of knowledge. The person has a lot of knowledge about a field. That's much less predictive than this kind of fire in the belly or passion.
Mm-hmm.
Another kind of indicator that many people point to is, I think badly named, but it's called grit, but the ability to tolerate failure.
Mm-hmm.
As you and I both know, our lives are full of failure. We have a research idea, it doesn't pan out. You have to be able to move on and learn from it, but also not let it slow you down. That capacity can be evident, and very often exceptionally gifted students have never failed. And so there's actually no evidence that they can tolerate failure.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. When we turn to faculty, when you've got more of a record, you've got the papers they've published, and so you can read them and see your judgment. We rely, as you know, very heavily on interview processes. I don't think the interview per se is so terrific as a source. It depends on the interviewer. But I think the job talk is an opportunity to interact with someone about their thinking, to see how they think and reason. Those are the places you want to judge people. And in many organizations that are not universities, there are, in the process of hiring, tasks to do that show whether a person can handle the job. Those are great indicators of whether somebody can do the job. And usually you give them a task that's relevant to the job. So one of my students who went to work in an applied research setting was given a set of data and invited to analyze what the data showed and write up a brief account of what was important in the data. That's a great test if that's what you're going to do on the job. Mm. So behavior, thinking about what is the evidence you want. Secondhand opinions, lots less relevant.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Then the next question I had has to do with you're giving that really nice Kahneman example with anesthesiologists getting this constant feedback. And I think you're right. Like in a lot of professions, including ours, I think we don't get that feedback. We get it on our own work. But in terms of like students and job candidates, it's a long process to get that feedback. Are there ways to learn, like to increase that feedback, you think?
I think there are. So in terms of our own behavior as professors, one of the things we can do is ask for feedback more often, from students. If you wait till the end of the semester, it's too late to fix it. That's the radiology example. If you want to live like an anesthesiologist, try to get some feedback sooner. And people who use clickers to see if students are understanding, that's one kind of feedback. It's not the only kind, but I think that was it's a good procedure for getting some information about what's going on. Are you with me? The other question you imply is from the perspective of us designing procedures, could we learn from our mistakes? And I think we absolutely could. One of the things that the advanced program recommends search committees do is when they get all the way through the process, they write a report, they should write a report reflecting on where they think bias ended up influencing the process anyway, even though they tried not to. So that's a way to reflect on and learn about bias. So one of the things we learned early on from these reports was that the committee operated in a very mindful and thoughtful way, but when it went to the department meeting, a lot of people who hadn't really thought as much about everything were operating on fast thinking. You know, I think so-and-so's great and that person doesn't look as good, and, you know, much more noise in the judgment process. So figuring out how to make sure the whole department grasps the importance of all these things was part of so we, as you know, recommended that anybody who's going to play a role in this evaluate candidates according to criteria, all the criteria. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I don't want to just keep talking.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you. And the last question is more general, I think, for anyone. And that is, I know you've thought a lot about recommendations, writing recommendations, how bias can seep into any of our recommendations for other people. And I know you talked a bit about it, but do you have some general guidelines for all of us who write recommendations?
So everybody in the advanced program, when we learned this literature, we all went back to our offices and looked at our own recommendations and were horrified. Male and female, everybody was, you know, oh my God, it's true. I do that. So that's step one. Pay attention to your own behavior. And secondly, you can change it. And I now very self-consciously think about, okay, am I using adjectives that are not strong enough because this is a female? You know, am I falling into that trap when I think she's brilliant? I'm not saying that. So self-reflection. There is a handout that's actually on the web of the advanced website that is about how to write fairer, more accurate recommendations. I mean, of course, we also risk overstating the qualifications of some people. I've never worried about that as much. It's the understating very well qualified people that is more of a worry, that our own students we love and care about, we might be doing them a disservice. So I think it's worth it to look at that handout and to reflect on our own tendencies to let bias creep in, not intentionally ever. It just happens and we can make it stop happening.
I think one of the things that maybe you wrote in the advanced guidelines was talking, I can't remember the term for it. Is it grindstone or?
That's right.
Yeah.
Grindstone adjectives are the ones that smart women get described by. So they're like really hardworking and dedicated and they work long hours, but there's no sign they're smart.
Right.
And, you know, that's what we're often looking for, is that spark. And again, if we relied on their own writing, maybe we would see that spark. But if we relied too much on the letter, we may be moved by those recommendation adjectives not to notice that this is a really bright student saying very exciting things.
Yeah, right. Okay, great. Right, wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. This has really been very informative and helpful.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the chance to talk about this.